Barbra Streisand is often spoken of as an icon whose presence reshaped American music and film, but her story is less about fame than about endurance shaped in absence. Her career stretches across decades not as a straight ascent but as a series of reinventions born from resistance, discipline, and emotional intensity that never fully quieted. Behind the awards, the records, and the global recognition lies a narrative of a woman who learned early that attention is not given freely, and that permanence must be constructed through repetition, precision, and refusal to disappear. Her voice became not just an instrument of performance but a structure of survival, carrying both clarity and strain in equal measure. What the world later recognized as mastery was, in its earliest form, a response to silence, an attempt to make presence undeniable in spaces that rarely made room for it. Every achievement that followed would carry this origin forward, shaping a career defined less by arrival than by continuation. Childhood fractures and the shape of absence. Born in Brooklyn in 1942, Barbra's earliest years were marked by absence that arrived before memory could fully form. Her father's death when she was still an infant left behind a void that was explained in fragments, softened by versions of truth that could be carried without breaking. The absence of his presence was not only emotional but structural, removing a foundation she would never consciously know but would nonetheless feel. In place of clarity, there was confusion shaped by silence and incomplete stories. What should have been rooted in understanding became instead an open space where imagination and longing filled gaps no one addressed. This early loss did not register as a single moment, but as an atmosphere that followed her into every room she entered. It created an early awareness that stability could vanish without warning, and that what remains unsaid can shape a life as strongly as what is spoken aloud. In this environment, she began forming a quiet internal resilience that would later define her work, a home without softness or certainty. When her mother remarried, the emotional structure of Barbra's home shifted again, not through comfort but through disconnection. Her stepfather's presence introduced a formality that never translated into closeness, leaving her to navigate relationships without clear emotional signals. Attempts to earn attention or approval were met with distance that did not respond to effort. In such an environment, she learned to adjust herself in advance, anticipating emotional absence before it arrived. The home itself became a place where feelings were managed internally rather than shared outwardly. Even care, when it appeared, arrived in indirect forms, gestures that maintained distance while acknowledging responsibility. This pattern shaped her understanding of love as something conditional and often withheld. Rather than breaking under this structure, she began adapting to it, developing an internal precision about how to move through emotional uncertainty. What she lacked in reassurance became a sharpened awareness of behavior, tone, and silence, all of which later translated into an extraordinary sensitivity in performance. Cramped spaces and the birth of control. Growing up in limited physical and emotional space contributed to a developing sense of internal containment. Privacy was not something lost over time but something never fully experienced, and this absence shaped her need for control in other areas of life. Without a private world to retreat into, she began constructing one internally, where detail, intention, and focus became essential tools. In shared rooms and crowded conditions, boundaries were unclear, and she learned to create order where none existed externally. This early environment did not allow for emotional expansion without consequence, so expression became measured and deliberate. The lack of personal space fostered an acute awareness of how much could be revealed without vulnerability becoming exposure. Over time, this translated into a disciplined approach to both speech and performance. Control was not an aesthetic choice but a necessity formed through circumstance. It became the foundation upon which she would later build a career defined by exactness, emotional precision, and an unwavering sense of internal direction. Nightclubs, silence, and the first audience. Before fame, there were small stages where recognition was uncertain and often absent. In dim nightclub settings, Barbra performed for audiences that did not always respond, leaving her suspended between expression and indifference. These early experiences were not defined by applause but by the tension of silence that followed effort. Singing in such environments required a different kind of strength, one not dependent on validation, but on continuation despite it. There were moments when she finished performing and felt no shift in the room, as though her presence had dissolved into the atmosphere without effect. Yet she remained. This persistence was not rooted in optimism, but in necessity, a refusal to let silence dictate withdrawal. Over time, these experiences reshaped her relationship to performance itself. It stopped being about receiving approval and became an act of insistence. Each return to the stage was a negotiation with uncertainty, and each silence that followed strengthened her resolve to continue rather than retreat. Broadway breakthrough and the architecture of recognition. The arrival of Funny Girl on Broadway marked a turning point where persistence began to intersect with recognition. What had once been unseen now demanded attention, and her performance carried a weight that transformed expectation itself. Yet even success did not simplify her relationship with the world around her. Recognition brought visibility, but it also introduced new forms of pressure, as if acknowledgement came with conditions attached. Transitioning into film extended this tension, placing her within systems that often questioned the very qualities that made her distinctive. Still, she remained anchored in the same internal structure that had formed in earlier years. Success did not erase silence, it reframed it. The applause that followed her performances did not replace earlier indifference but existed alongside it, creating a layered understanding of what it meant to be seen. In this space, achievement was not an endpoint but another stage of negotiation between expression and expectation, reinvention and resistance in creative authority. As her career expanded, so too did resistance to her creative authority. Projects like Yentl were not simply artistic endeavors but assertions of vision in spaces that were not accustomed to granting control. Each step into directing or producing became an extension of earlier lessons about insistence and refusal to yield. Challenges were not always direct. Often they appeared as doubt, hesitation, or reluctance from systems unprepared for her level of autonomy. Yet she continued forward, allowing the work itself to validate what permission did not. Reinvention became a consistent thread in her career, not as a strategy but as a necessity for creative survival. Across decades, she shifted between roles, mediums, and expectations without abandoning her core approach. The resistance she encountered did not diminish her output. Instead, it refined it, sharpening her sense of direction and reinforcing the importance of self-definition in environments that often sought to define her externally. The weight of perception and public language. With success came language that attempted to categorize her, words like demanding or exacting that often reflected discomfort more than accuracy. These labels followed her across projects, shaping public perception in ways that rarely aligned with internal reality. What was seen as intensity was often discipline. What was called control was often clarity. Yet she did not spend her career correcting these interpretations. Instead, she continued to work within them, allowing results to speak where explanations would not suffice. Over time, perception became another form of silence to navigate, one that required resilience rather than response. The more established her career became, the more fixed these interpretations grew, yet they never altered the trajectory of her work. Instead, they highlighted the gap between external observation and internal intention. In this gap, she continued to build a body of work that reflected consistency rather than accommodation, maintaining a steady alignment with her own standards regardless of external framing. Intimacy and the difficulty of being seen. Outside of performance, intimacy introduced a different kind of vulnerability, one not structured by control or preparation. Relationships exposed her to emotional spaces where outcomes could not be managed with precision. In such moments, she encountered forms of uncertainty that differed from professional challenge. Connection required surrender in ways that conflicted with the internal systems she had built for stability. Experiences of closeness, whether brief or sustained, often carried complexity shaped by visibility and external expectation. Even genuine connection could be disrupted by external interpretation, creating distance where none was intended. In these dynamics, she learned that emotional openness carried both depth and risk. Rather than withdrawing entirely, she continued to engage, though always with awareness of how fragile such spaces could be. Intimacy, for her, became an area where clarity was never guaranteed and where understanding often coexisted with restraint, love, distance, and the pressure of circumstance. Certain relationships in her life unfolded under conditions that made permanence difficult. Connections with figures such as Omar Sharif or Pierre Trudeau existed within contexts shaped by external responsibility, public scrutiny, and competing demands. These relationships were not defined by absence of feeling but by the limits placed upon what feeling could become. Moments of closeness were real but often temporary, shaped by timing that could not be altered. In these experiences, she encountered the reality that emotional truth does not always translate into continuity. What remained afterward was not resolution but understanding, an awareness that some connections exist fully only within specific boundaries. Rather than diminishing their significance, this recognition gave them a different kind of weight, one defined by presence rather than permanence. Over time, these experiences contributed to a deeper comprehension of how love and circumstance often exist in tension rather than alignment. Legacy built through continuation, not arrival. Across decades, Barbra Streisand's career accumulated milestones that might suggest completion, yet her trajectory resists the idea of arrival. Each achievement became part of a larger continuum, rather than a final point. What distinguishes her legacy is not only its scale but its persistence across changing cultural landscapes. The discipline that formed in early absence evolved into a sustained creative force that adapted without dissolving. Even as recognition grew, so too did the internal silence that first shaped her voice. Rather than disappearing, it became integrated into her work, giving it depth and emotional complexity. Her legacy is therefore not simply measured in records or awards but in continuity, the ability to remain present across time without losing internal coherence. After the applause, what still remains unsaid? Even after decades of recognition, global admiration, and a body of work that reshaped both music and film, the space surrounding Barbra Streisand's life does not resolve into closure. Achievement, in her case, never functioned as an endpoint that quieted earlier tensions. It simply added new layers of expectation and reflection. The public narrative often frames her story as one of arrival, of breakthrough, dominance, and lasting influence, but internally, what persists is something less visible and more continuous. Success did not erase the earlier architecture of absence, distance, and emotional discipline that formed her approach to both art and life. Instead, it gave those elements a different scale, one that extended across decades and continents. In private reflection, what often lingers is not the applause itself, but the moments after it fades, when the structure of performance dissolves and the individual is left alone with their own awareness. It is here that the earlier patterns return in subtler form, not as pain alone, but as recognition of how deeply formative silence once was. The same sensitivity that allowed her to shape emotionally precise performances also makes stillness more pronounced when external validation disappears. In that stillness, memory and present experience blur, and what remains is not resolution but continuity. Relationships, creativity, and identity all converge in this space where certainty is never fully established. The external world may assign meaning through awards, numbers, or legacy, but internal experience remains more fluid, shaped by perception rather than conclusion. Even reinvention, which defined so much of her career, does not eliminate this internal continuity. It only redirects it into new forms of expression. Each era of her work reflects not a departure from earlier self, but a transformation of the same underlying emotional language. Ultimately, what persists is not the need for validation, nor the absence of it, but the awareness that neither can fully define a life built on endurance. The silence that once shaped her has never fully left. It has simply changed texture, becoming something she moves within rather than something she escapes.